to our final panel discussion on our inclusive financial regulation and supervision stream. We have one more presentation there for you under the stream later on today. It will be in French, but this is our last English panel, and our guests today are Juan Carlos from CGAP and Anatol from Toronto Centre. I've worked very closely with them as we've developed our first ever Financial Authority exclusive program, Digital Financial Inclusion Supervision, which has been going very well, exciting times. We went through a crazy journey developing the program, but I'm excited to say we've produced a very high quality program that students have been excited about. So Juan Carlos is with the World Bank through, with CGAP, and Anatol is with Toronto Centre, and both bring a wealth of knowledge in financial regulation and supervision. And that's why we have them today in our panel to discuss the transition from compliance-based to risk-based regulation and supervision in emerging market and developing economies. And I like that we're specifically focusing in EMDEs, because a lot of times most of these discussions take a focus on the developed world. And I like that we're looking at the developing world because of our nature of having limited resources. And so we need to try to start thinking about that and how we would work around that to try and transition to a risk-based approach with those limited resources in place. So I'll start with you, Anatol. And you at Toronto Centre, you have a vast experience in training supervisors. And as we start this important panel, I'd like for us to start with the basics before we dig in and answer deeper questions. And I'd like for you to just lay the foundation and help us work and understand the difference between risk-based supervision and compliance-based supervision, because sometimes a country will be quick to say, no, we're applying the risk-based supervision approach. But when you actually look down on the fact and the matter of things, they are somewhere in between where they're applying both, but they're not fully applying the risk-based approach to supervision.
Yeah, that's so true, Nolwazi. And I think that one of the things that binds emerging markets and developed economies are the fact that there is never enough resources for a regulator. There will always be more work than capacity. And so these are challenges that are true across supervisory authorities. So let's just do a basic comparison of supervisory models, starting with the traditional compliance supervision. Typically, there's a focus by the supervisor on information gathering and reporting. There's a large amount of information that is received, and the allocation of resources is into reviewing these information, but that information is not always relevant all the time. Furthermore, the regulatory frameworks in developed economies are set on the requirements about what can and cannot be done. And so regulated entities spend their time trying to work around what I can do and what I can't do, because it doesn't always fit with their business model. And so regulators are constantly trying to understand what's going on. There's a typical segmentation of business between analysis and examination that limits the understanding of a supervisor to a particular aspect of the supervisory process. And then there tends to be a lot of excessive focus on evaluating the work done by other professionals like actuaries and auditors. So there's a validation of work by those professionals by the supervisor. If we then say, those are the characteristics of a traditional compliance model, what does a risk-based supervisory model look like? And so I'll try to parallel those points. First of all, in risk-based, there's less information requested, and it's requested periodically, and it is focused information requests. That doesn't mean that there aren't annual and quarterly filings that are required, but other information is that information is specific to the statutory requirements and the supervisory requirements. There's a focus on risk and relevant risks. And not risk-based supervision does not claim to cover all risks. The regulatory requirements in the jurisdiction tend to be proportionable and adjustable according to the inherent risks of the marketplace, of the sector, and of the financial institutions or regulated entities. There is specialization within a risk-based supervisory model, but it tends to then be on expertise. For example, not by analysis or by examination. Typically, those are handled by a supervisor, but the expertise differentiates at capital, credit, market conduct, where there's deep expertise in specific risk areas. And that instead of focusing on the work of others, the supervisory regime under risk-based tends to look at risk management at the company and its control functions like corporate governance, senior management, market conduct to make sure that they are effective. So if I compare the two, then the compliance model looks at more details rather than the big picture, which is what's needed under risk-based supervision. It doesn't deal with significant risks unless they come out of non-compliance, whereas risk-based looks at the risk, not how it is in effect under the law. And then there's a tendency to be very focused under compliance rather than looking at the risk of the entity, the group, the sector, the product line themselves. So that in a nutshell is sort of a picture of the compliance and the risk-based and the advantages of a risk-based model.
Thank you very much, Anatol. And I like that you mentioned something about proportionality, because before I proceed to the second part of your question, I want to ask Juan Carlos to take us through the concept of proportionality within the scope of supervision. And Juan Carlos, do you think that proportionate risk-based supervision can lead to enhanced financial inclusion? Is this something that should be on the radar then of emerging markets to pursue the RBS approach for the financial inclusion objective?
Thanks, Nolwazi, for these questions. And yes, most certainly. I believe that proportionate supervision supports and empowers regulation that promotes financial inclusion. Now, a jurisdiction could have the best enabling regulatory framework for financial inclusion with proportionate regulation on money issuers, agents, customer due diligence, consumer protection, all that could be top of the line. However, regulation would not be enough to really promote sustainable financial inclusion. Supervision is critical, is fundamental to ensure that such regulations that are proportionate are effectively implemented, and that financial institutions adequately identify, manage, and mitigate the risks so that financial inclusion is sustained over the time and that provides longer-term value to customers and to the market. Also, proportionality demands a solid understanding of financial institutions. When applying a proportionate risk-based approach, supervisory efforts are commensurate with the business models, the complexities, the risk profiles of providers, and do not impose excessive compliance costs that can impact providers' viability and ability to cater to underserved populations. So proportionate and risk-based supervision enables supervisors to allocate their scarce resources, as Anatol was saying, effectively, so that they can prioritize and intensify their limited efforts based on the risks that they observe and they assess. And this aspect is actually very important in the current environment of a rapidly evolving digital financial services market, where a large number of new types of providers are appearing, are emerging, in many cases partnering with incumbent financial institutions. So a proportionate risk-based approach will help supervisors reflect on what are the key and substantial risks they should be most concerned about, where those risks reside, for example, in the principal financial institution or the outsourced outside third party. Also, at what stage of supervision the risks can be better managed and mitigated? For example, at the authorization or the licensing or the on-site supervision stage. And another important point is that the approach will help you separate those risks that are inherent to the individual provider from those that are more market level, market-wide type of risks. And finally, supervisors will benefit from keeping an ICIP approach in mind when applying proportionate supervision. This means that they should balance the risks to financial inclusion alongside the risks to financial stability, consumer protection, and integrity.
Thank you, Juan Carlos. I think to add to that then, back to you, Anatol, what other potential benefits does adopting a risk-based approach can mean, or can a developed or emerging economy glean or see as they do this in their economy?
Yeah, so Juan Carlos has painted a very good picture about proportionality, and a key part of proportional supervision is the use of judgment and knowing when and where to apply the full extent of the law and the full extent of supervisory powers. And risk-based supervision is about judgment. So if you aren't able to exercise judgment, everything is a tick box, or it's a list of things that I have to do. You'll never make that jump to proportionality, and you'll always be following a list of things to do. And that, as Juan Carlos talked about, stability, inclusion, and protection will never be balanced effectively. So I think the first point has to be that a risk-based supervisory framework gives you the ability to use judgment effectively. And as we talked about, there's limited resources, so you have to prioritize. There will always be choices to be made. And risk-based supervision is about developing an effective way to analyze and to systematize the identification and addressing risk. And so there will always be risks in a risk-based environment that get less attention than they might in a compliance environment. And in fact, you have to be confident enough to overlook some risks because you do not have the resources to address it. And when we talk about risks, we talk about it in the context of the supervisory authorities or agencies' mandate and objectives. How do they achieve what they're supposed to be doing? Because you can't achieve that by poking at every little piece of activity that's going on. You need to focus on those that cause the greatest harm. We often think about the greatest harm as those issues that affect the largest number of depositors, consumers, lenders, borrowers, and where the amount of money is. So, is 10 people with $100,000 more at risk than 10 people with $20,000? And you're going to have to choose between those. What else do we need to think about? We talked about tough choices, the allocation of resources. As a former supervisory executive in a cross-sectoral environment, you were always moving resources from one area to the other. It didn't mean complete abandonment. That it's not an absolute choice that I can only do this or this, but I can't do them equally. So I will spend less resources on one and more on another. And RBS does not eliminate risk. It's not a way to avoid risk. It is simply a way of putting your resources in the right context for your supervisory objectives. And at the end of the day, your organization has to have the understanding and communicate the need for risk management at the entity level, because the supervisor cannot do all the work themselves. They must be able to rely on the internal control functions and the risk management functions at the entities themselves, because that is part of that allocation of resources. If we're confident in our entities that they are going to be working in compliance and that they have a risk-based approach internally as well, then it's much easier for the supervisor to adapt and be more successful in a risk-based approach.
So what I'm hearing from both you and Juan Carlos is that there might be a gap in understanding the risks that a country might face. So how do you think that gap might be bridged? And I'm posing this question to both of you, because now if countries want to attempt to apply the risk-based approach, and they might still be sticking to compliance-based because it's easier, it's a tick box situation. Whereas with risk-based approach means they have to take a step further and understand their risks, and they may not even know where to begin. So what would your advice be on where to start? Yes, there's a lot of manuals, there's a lot of benchmarking, there's a lot of FATF style regional bodies that could help them. But now, where do they begin in understanding their risks to be able to move completely to the risk-based approach, even from regulation to supervision?
Juan Carlos, you want to start?
I can start, yes. Because
okay, I'll let you go.
This is a great point, Nolwazi, and I think it goes back to the point that Anatol made on the importance of building this as a mindset, as a shift in the way that you do your work. And this actually is learning by doing too. So you start, you do measurement, you check the information, and you keep doing it. I used to be also a supervisor in Peru for microfinance issues. And at the beginning, you were trying to figure out yourself which would be the main risks that could be emerging on new types of microfinance institutions. So the main point is gathering good data, analyzing this data, doing it from a market perspective initially, then going to check, and talk also with your industry providers to better understand what's happening, and understand the business model so that you can be better informed while you do the analysis. And don't be afraid of not understanding necessarily everything at the beginning. Keep doing it. Build a judgment supportive environment, as Anatol said, so that you can discuss among the teams which are the main risks that you are observing, and debate among your team whether you are on the right track, and check it within the industry. And it's an art, I would say too, and you will get better with time.
That's right on, Juan Carlos. I can remember, I was a youngish supervisor when RBS was introduced, and it is scary because you're using your judgment, and you want to do a good job, and you're saying, well, what is the greatest risk? And so the organization needs to say what are, help you understand what those risks are at the macro level, so that as you do your individual supervisory work, you're aligned with that. You have to think about it as the process. You need to understand what the objectives of RBS are, live it, go through. Quite often when people introduce an RBS model, they do panels that calibrate risk across the organization. So when I say something is a medium high in my institution, you can look at your institution and say, okay, mine is medium because I don't have these elements of that characteristics, or vice versa. And that things will go wrong. People will misassess risk positively or negatively. And typically in an introductory environment, people tend to be risk averse, and so they overrate the risks. And so then you may not have a good allocation of risk because you're focused on things that aren't really as risky as you think. So people need to have a supportive environment. Management in particular needs to think about how they're going to respond when things go wrong, be supportive. That doesn't mean that every mistake is overlooked. There are some that may be reckless, but learning to better assess risk in a supportive environment will help. that collaborative, I think you really hit that on the head, working together to understand risk, and the panel approach is a good way systemically within the organization to calibrate risk across individuals. And this is not a once and done process. It's a living model. The first couple of years of risk-based supervision will be intense in trying to get everybody on the same page, but risks change. How you look at risks, the information available on risk. So it's dynamic from that perspective as well.
Yeah, so I think you both effectively discussed my question that I was going to go to Juan Carlos on the sequencing of from compliance-based to risk-based. So let me come back to you, Juan Carlos, on what you think the major operational challenges would be then in low resource economies like EMDEs that they would encounter when moving from a risk-based approach, from a compliance-based to a risk-based approach, because there's the operational side as well, dealing with their DFSPs, or rather their providers, and now having to work with them to calibrate on the data they may need that they never needed before, because now they're risk profiling them each differently. And so what do you think that those problems may be, especially now with the time delays of the institutions pushing back? No, we need this time to calibrate our systems to be able to give you this data and all of that. So how, apart from those challenges and the other challenges you may share, can you also, and you, Juan Carlos, please feel free to jump in here, any solutions or any advice on how they could work around those with your experiences, both of you being former supervisors? I was a macro prudential supervisor, not a micro. So I worked more on give me all the bank data, not the individual banks.
I hear you, Nolwazi. So I can share a few of the challenges that we've observed, and I think it will resonate with anyone working in emerging markets. Starting with the resources, there's very limited staffing, overall resources to supervise, especially an increasing number of providers of different types, and they're serving a large number of customers. So it's now a different way of looking at systemic important institutions, which is an important change that even the Basel Committee has done to identify systemically importance, not only by the volume of assets of financial institutions, but also the number of customers they are serving, especially when we're talking about emerging markets and financial inclusion context. So we have a lot of small providers that may be attending a lot of customers, but they are appearing and more appearing in the digital financial sector. So the number of staff that need to look at all these number of providers is limited. So that's where also the limited resources, the challenge of limited resources appear. Also, there are new mandates. Increasingly, supervisors not only need to look at stability, they need to look at market conduct, consumer protection, financial integrity, financial innovation, competition, data protection, cybersecurity issues. So there are more issues that financial supervisors need to be more versed on. So time they need to be taken for supervisors to better understand, to build their capacity on these issues now need to be built into supervisory capacity building efforts. Related to this, limited knowledge and expertise on these new type of business models, providers, and technology, because we are now looking at different type of tools of use of technology by new types of providers. Now, an interesting challenge too is the unclear or limited legal powers that supervisors may have to collect relevant information and perform supervisory activities. So in some laws, in some regulations, supervisors may not be able to collect data from third parties to help them understand the type of risks that appear in the market. Also, inability to collect reliable data and market intelligence from digital financial services. and another one could be inadequate data analysis and visualization tools for supervisors. And in terms of key ways to address all of this, I think number one is start with organizing yourselves. And this is a very simple, but sometimes not done. And this means just identify which are your main goals as a supervisor, your main objectives, and your main risks. Just putting that in a mapping exercise can help you identify what are the most relevant risks for you. How can you assign resources to those relevant high-level risks in a way related to what Anatol said? And what are the mechanisms to build the capacity to address and better understand the risks that you have identified from your assessment, your initial assessment? So I'll stop there because I think we're getting short of time.
Anatol?
So
Just 2 minutes.
Yeah, I'll be quick. So I've been through the process as a supervisor, as trying to implement risk-based supervision as an executive, and I've watched a number of jurisdictions go through the risk-based supervisory process. So first of all, it is possible. That's the good news. I think you need to do a couple of things on a basic level. You need to look at your regulatory framework and statutory framework to make sure that RBS is compatible with the laws. There's no point in building an organization that is RBS focused and the legal framework restricts you in how you can approach it. It's not a technical exercise. It's not about having a manual that says doing this. It goes back to what Juan Carlos said at the very beginning. This is a cultural, deep-seated behavioral change in the way you think. It is a mindset shift that needs to be done. And the other piece is that there are stakeholders that are involved, and you need to make sure that you have the right buy-in, but whether it's internal through the management of the organization, whether it's the entities that you're regulating, the consumers, the users of financial services, they need to understand how this change is going on. And while many people will embrace the idea of, employees will embrace the idea of autonomy and the use of judgment, that could be scary for some, and they may simply resist change or be uncomfortable with change. So a change management context for what is being done, as with any major project, needs to be brought together. And you need to build a core team that will carry the day for the organizations and build the plan, work on the technical activity on a full-time basis. It's not something you can do along with a lot of other work. So even if it's a small team, have them dedicated to working on an RBS model for the organization. They then become the champions and the pilot for the organization, and they will be a good resource for going along. So, just a little pitch for the Toronto Centre. We have on our website a number of Toronto Centre notes that are about RBS, the implementation, the context, and even one for senior managers on the challenges of implementing RBS. So feel free to check our website out and see what resources are there for you. And thanks for asking me to participate in this. It's been quite enjoyable. I always like working with Juan Carlos as well, and we'll continue to work together too. So appreciate it.
Yes, thank you so much for both of your time. The 30 minutes always flies by. It's this is my fifth panel, and it's every time the 30 minutes just flies by. But I just want to say thank you to you both for your time and give you the last 2 minutes to also say your goodbyes. This is my goodbye. Thank you so much to all the participants. I hand over to you, Juan Carlos and Anatol, to say your last goodbyes in our last minutes.
Well, thank you very much, Nolwazi. It's always a pleasure to work together with Anatol and with you, as we did in the DFIS course, the Supervision of Digital Financial Services, which is a also very useful course that we've worked on. And yeah, from CGAP's perspective as well, we are in the final process of issuing a DFS supervision toolkit that will hopefully be published early next year. So we'll make sure that colleagues are aware of that. And yeah, a final key message is risk-based supervision is doable, it's feasible, it takes time, but it's something that will eventually definitely help the work of supervisors. So don't be afraid, jump on it, and you have several resources from our organizations that can help you navigate that important type of work. Good luck on all your work, and thanks again for the invitation.
Congratulations on a good conference, Nolwazi, and the panel. We'll look forward to working with both of you again in the future.